I was a Mossad agent sent into Somalia, a place where loyalty is bought and silence is worth more than life. I went there hunting for information. But something else was hunting me. The mission began under classified orders, shrouded in secrecy and urgency. Coordinates were locked onto a remote region of Somalia, far beyond the typical military intelligence operations. The atmosphere was thick with tension, every decision weighed down by decades of geopolitical maneuvering. We were trained professionals, hardened by decades of Cold War mentalities. But beneath the routine of this mission, something inexplicable stirred. The mission, as detailed to us, was simple on the surface. Retrieve a piece of lost technology hidden beneath the shadowed streets of Mogadishu. We were told that a Soviet scientist, now missing for years, had developed something in a subterranean complex, a device capable of influencing the most obscure corners of science. However, it soon became evident that what we sought had nothing to do with technology as we knew it. The weather was unforgiving as we touched down, an endless expanse of barren desert stretching as far as the eye could see. The only sounds were the grinding whir of our equipment and the occasional hiss of wind across the sand. Even now, I can hear that hum of machinery, that feeling of encroaching doom pressing against my ribs. As we stood in the darkened compound, looking at the dilapidated structure, the oppressive heat of the Somali sun bore down, the air tasting faintly of metal and dust. It was supposed to be a mission like any other. Secure the asset, extract. But even then I felt it, an unease that started as an itch at the back of my mind and quickly grew into a gnawing certainty that nothing here would be ordinary. The coordinates were not just random. They pointed to a facility that had once been under Soviet control, built during the height of the Cold War. Intelligence reports were sparse, and those that existed were often contradictory. The mission was highly classified. No room for failure, no tolerance for hesitation. For the Israeli government, the stakes were high. If the technology we were after truly had the power we had been led to believe, it could tip the balance of global power in ways that no one could predict. Our team had been chosen for specific expertise, yet none of us had any idea what we were really walking into. We were under orders to retrieve whatever was inside the abandoned facility, no questions asked. The implications of failure were even more significant than our mission itself. Our mission was to secure this technological artifact, an object that, on paper, was of immense importance. But what neither the Israelis nor the Soviets had anticipated was the ancient nature of what we were dealing with. It was as if time itself had warped around this place. The deeper we ventured, the more the concept of time itself seemed to fracture. Those first moments when we set foot inside the darkened hallways, I should have realized that our success or failure was irrelevant compared to the sheer scale of the forces at play. The device was just a key, but what it unlocked, that was something none of us could have predicted. Our team was a specialized unit, trained for operations in hostile environments. I was the senior officer, the one who had led similar missions in the past, each one colder and more calculated than the last. My role was to lead, to analyze threats, to act as the rational center in a field of uncertainty. Alongside me were 5 others, each chosen for their specific skills. There was Yossi, the demolitions expert, whose reputation for precision was only matched by his reckless streak. His hands were steady when it mattered, but I could tell something was off about him even before we boarded the transport. His eyes darted around, and I could swear I saw a flicker of something beneath the surface, something that would unravel soon enough. Then there was Miriam, the medic, calm in her precision and scientific knowledge, though as the days wore on, I would come to witness how the unimaginable could twist even the most hardened of professionals. Her calm demeanor was a false security. She could barely maintain her grip on sanity by the end. Our communications specialist, Amir, was an analytical mind, always calculating risk, always watching signals. What he failed to understand was that the signals he would begin to receive were not from any terrestrial source. His role would soon change from expert technician to conduit for something much older, much darker. We had Avner, the veteran leader. His experience was unmatched. He had seen countless horrors, and yet I saw him struggle as the days unfolded. His leadership never wavered outwardly, but in his eyes, something broke. The stories he had lived through and survived were nothing compared to what awaited us. Lastly, there was Netta, the quiet technician, who had the unique ability to interface with any machine, no matter how ancient or alien. I never questioned her competence until we got too close to the heart of the facility. Then I saw something twist in her eyes that I could not understand. Something deep and unsettling. Each one of us was a distinct part of a puzzle, but none of us were prepared for what was to come. The mission would test us in ways that defied any normal military or scientific understanding. The briefing was tense. We were to extract the device, identify its nature, and return it to headquarters for further analysis. On paper, it was a straightforward operation. Fast insertion, secure the asset, and exfil. No one mentioned the presence of supernatural forces. Those remained classified, whispered only in closed circles. The briefing room was dim, the air cold, the walls lined with maps which now seemed inadequate. Coordinates were marked, but the path was treacherous, an old military complex now in ruins. Little was known about its current state, but we were told the facility had been abandoned, its security system compromised, and there was little risk of encountering a hostile force. Despite this, I felt an undercurrent of something more sinister, an intangible weight pressing in from all sides. The team gathered their gear, standard-issue rifles, sidearms, and communication equipment. But the further we moved away from the airfield and into the harsh desert landscape, the more it felt as though something was pulling us toward the facility. The desert stretched endlessly before us, a vast empty void that seemed to contain all the secrets of the world. I could not shake the feeling that we were not alone, never alone. Yet no one voiced the same unease. It was only as the final words of the briefing echoed in the back of my mind that I understood what was at stake. We were not just retrieving a piece of technology. We were unlocking something that should have stayed buried. The question was no longer about what was hidden beneath Mogadishu, but whether we would make it back to tell anyone the truth. The journey to the target felt interminable, each moment stretching longer than the last. Our transport, a military-grade helicopter, sliced through the night sky, the constant hum of the engines filling the cabin with a dull thrum. The stars outside blinked in their cold, indifferent pattern, offering no solace. The air felt thick, as though the atmosphere itself was pressing in from all sides, pushing us into an uncertain fate. The faint smell of fuel and the tang of metallic sweat lingered in the cramped space as we secured our gear for the insertion. It was supposed to be routine, a textbook operation. But nothing about this mission felt routine. Not anymore. The closer we got to the target zone, the more the environment seemed to distort. The desert landscape below us was not as we had seen it in the reconnaissance photos. The sand, normally a monotone beige, appeared to ripple, darker streaks moving through it like veins beneath skin. The air shimmered in unnatural ways, as if reality itself was bending to some unseen force. I glanced at Yossi, the demolitions expert. His eyes narrowed, his fingers twitching slightly, and I saw a flicker of doubt in his otherwise confident demeanor. Miriam sat quietly beside him, her brow furrowed as she studied her equipment. Amir, the communications specialist, was muttering softly to himself as he tinkered with the radio. His movements were quick, jerky, as if something was not quite right in the signals he was receiving. He kept glancing at his screen, his expression increasingly unsettled. The desert below seemed endless, and as we passed over the last stretch of it, the temperature inside the helicopter plummeted. I felt a strange chill creep down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The wind howled against the fuselage, louder now, as if it were trying to warn us. No one spoke as the landscape morphed from barren wasteland into something far stranger, a vast, seemingly untouched jungle that stretched to the horizon. We had been briefed on the surroundings, but this was something else. The green of the foliage was unnatural, the shadows under the trees too deep, too impossible to be real. "We are nearing the drop zone," I said, breaking the silence, my voice sounding almost hollow against the rising wind. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, and the craft began its descent. I looked down at the ground below, the drop zone coming into clearer view, but something caught my eye. A movement, a blur, something that should not have been there. I blinked, and it was gone. My hand instinctively tightened around my weapon. My senses were on high alert, but I told myself to stay calm. We had a job to do, nothing more. The helicopter touched down with a soft thud, the whirring of the blades slicing through the air as they slowed. The moment the ramp lowered, the harsh desert wind hit us, its dry heat suffocating. We filed out quickly, each of us scanning the surroundings with practiced precision. The ground was cracked, the earth disturbed in ways that made no sense, as though something ancient, had been moving beneath it. We checked our gear once more, ensuring everything was operational. I motioned for the team to move out. The mission was about to begin in earnest. Our boots crunched on the sand, the sounds muffled by the intense stillness around us. It was too quiet. The usual hum of wildlife, the calls of birds, the rustle of wind through trees. It was absent. Only the oppressive silence remained, a silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. The further we advanced into the dense jungle, the more the air seemed to vibrate, faintly at first, then stronger with each step. There was a hum in the air, a subtle, unnerving frequency that we could not pinpoint. Amir checked his radio equipment, his brows furrowed. "I am getting strange readings," he said, his voice tight, his fingers trembling on the device. It's like the signals are being..." He paused, his face pale. "Distorted." I nodded, signaling the team to keep moving. But my own mind was racing. Something was not right. We were not in the place we thought we were. We had been dropped in the wrong area, or the land had shifted. No map, no satellite image could account for what we were seeing, and the longer we moved forward, the more I could feel it. The weight of something watching, waiting. We reached the entrance to the facility after what felt like hours, the stone walls looming ahead, dark and foreboding. The jungle seemed to close in around us, the shadows beneath the trees twisting unnaturally, as though something unseen was creeping through the underbrush. We were too far in now to turn back. The heavy iron doors of the complex creaked open as I signaled to Avner, and the team filed inside. As the doors closed behind us, the hum of the outside world faded. It was replaced by something far worse. The air inside the facility was cold, far colder than it should have been. A strange metallic scent filled my nostrils, and the hum, the vibration, the pulse in the air. It was louder here, more palpable. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, a low, unnatural hum that made my head ache. As we moved further in, I noticed something odd. Flickers of light, brief flashes of shadow that darted along the walls. The shadows were moving. I should have known even then that something was terribly wrong. As we descended deeper into the facility, the temperature dropped sharply. Our breath became visible, forming mist that dissipated in the oppressive, unnatural chill. The walls, once smooth and functional, now seemed warped, almost organic, as if the facility had begun to pulse with a life of its own. I ran a hand along the cracked surfaces, feeling the distinct tingle of static energy beneath my fingertips. Something, I could not tell what, was feeding into the facility from the outside, changing it. There was a sense that this place had not just been abandoned, it had been waiting, dormant, for something to stir it from its slumber. The corridors stretched ahead of us in a disorienting maze, the architecture impossible to track. What had once been a functional military base was now a cavern of forgotten halls and corridors that seemed to shift, their dimensions warping as we passed through them. The flickering lights overhead did little to alleviate the disorientation. The deeper we ventured, the more the hallway geometry seemed to twist and fold in on itself. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to breathe, shifting in unnatural rhythms, as though something was alive within them, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Amir, once calm and collected, had grown more tense by the minute. His eyes darted from one end of the hallway to the other, his hand constantly adjusting the frequency on his communication device. "Something is off," he muttered under his breath, though it was unclear whether he was speaking to himself or to the team. "I'm picking up static. It's like the walls are talking, but I can't make out the signal." The sounds within the facility grew more pronounced as we advanced. The hum of electricity was no longer just a background noise. It became a tangible presence, a force that seemed to tug at my insides. My heartbeat quickened, and I found myself listening for something, anything, that might break the oppressive silence. The faintest sound of footsteps echoed behind us, a sound that did not match our own, as if something, or someone, was walking just out of sight. I glanced over my shoulder. There was nothing. Just the darkened corridor stretching on endlessly. Miriam was unusually quiet, her face pale under the weak light of our headlamps. She kept close to the walls, her eyes scanning every corner with a nervous intensity. I noticed her hand was trembling as she adjusted her medical kit, and I realized that she too could feel it. The weight of something lurking in the corners of our vision, something that could not be explained by any military technology or understanding of the natural world. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the mission. But the air felt thick, as though the very space we moved through was becoming more oppressive with every step. The further we descended, the more the facility seemed to distort around us. Hallways that should have been straight twisted at odd angles. Rooms that should not have existed appeared in impossible spaces, and we were forced to circle back, only to find that the layout was changing in front of our eyes. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, rearranging themselves as we moved through them. What had once been a military base had transformed into a labyrinth that defied all logic. Time itself felt distorted, and every second stretched unnaturally long, as if we were no longer bound by the laws of nature. I reached out and touched the wall again, feeling the strange warmth beneath the surface, the same energy I had sensed earlier. It pulsed beneath my fingers, steady and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the facility itself. The hum in the air became louder, more insistent. The lights overhead flickered more frequently now, casting long, jittery shadows that twisted unnervingly. As I pulled my hand away, I thought I saw something in the dark. A shape, just on the edge of my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. "Keep moving," I ordered, my voice sounding hollow in the tense air. I knew that panic would only make things worse. We had a job to do, and we had to push forward. But every instinct screamed that we were no longer in control, that something was pulling us deeper into this place, into whatever eldritch force had taken root here. As we moved into a large open chamber, the atmosphere shifted yet again. The air thickened, almost to the point where it felt like breathing was becoming difficult. My chest tightened, a growing sense of dread pressing in on me. The chamber was enormous, the ceiling so high that the shadows seemed to stretch infinitely upward. Strange symbols, glowing faintly with a sickly green hue, were etched into the walls. They seemed to shift subtly, as though they were alive, evolving with every second. I stepped closer to inspect them, but the moment my fingers brushed against the stone, a sudden chill shot through my body. "Something is wrong here," Miriam whispered, her voice trembling. "This place, it's not just a facility. It's something else." I nodded, but I could not bring myself to say it aloud. We were no longer just dealing with a military installation. The more I looked at those symbols, the more they seemed to mock me, as though they knew something I did not. And then, I saw it. At the far end of the chamber, partially obscured by the darkness, a faint glow emanated from an alcove in the wall. It was the source, the device we had come for. The object was an anomaly in itself. Surrounded by a haze of shifting energy, it seemed to hum with a frequency that resonated deep within me, stirring something ancient and unsettling. The faint glow intensified, pulsing in time with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. We had found it. But I knew, deep down, that what we had come for was no longer a simple artifact. It was a doorway, a portal. Before I could signal the team, something moved in the darkness. A shape, a silhouette, far larger than any of us, twisted and undulated with unnatural grace. I could feel the air grow even colder as it approached, the humming energy from the device intensifying. It was not just the technology we had to worry about. It was what guarded it. The team gathered closer, our weapons raised instinctively as the shape in the darkness grew clearer. The temperature in the chamber plummeted, and I felt an overwhelming sense of cold seep through my bones. The energy in the air was thick, pressing, oppressive, and the once invisible hum of the facility became almost deafening. It was as though the very walls were breathing with us, their pulse syncing with our heartbeat. I ordered a quick sweep of the area, trying to maintain control of the situation, but every movement felt like we were trespassing in a world that was never meant for us. Yossi, usually the most fearless among us, hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for something. "This isn't right," he muttered, his voice low but strained. He glanced over at me, the unease in his expression palpable. "The place is alive. It's waiting." The rest of us didn't answer. We had no words for what we were feeling. The weight of the moment was too much, and the urgency to complete the mission clouded our minds. Miriam began taking readings from her medical kit, though I could see her face pale under the flickering light. Her hands shook as she adjusted her equipment. She looked around, her expression vacant, as if lost in a trance. "The air," she said, her voice trailing off. "The oxygen levels are—" She stopped, biting her lip, unsure of how to finish the sentence. I moved toward the object in the alcove, the source of the glow. It was a device, but not like any I had seen before. It pulsed with energy, the symbols on its surface shifting in eerie patterns. The hum in the air was stronger now, reverberating through the bones of the facility. I knew we needed to secure it. But what was waiting for us in the depths of this place was becoming clearer with each step I took. The shadows around the chamber thickened, twisting into forms that seemed too alive to be natural. It felt as though the facility itself was beginning to bend, to fold, under the strain of whatever was locked within its walls. Amir stood by his equipment scanning the signals. He adjusted his radio several times, muttering incoherently under his breath. "There's something else. Something's broadcasting. It's not human. It's everywhere. It's inside the walls, inside the air." "Keep it together, Amir," I ordered, though the unease was creeping into my own voice. I had no explanation for what he was picking up, but I knew one thing. We were on borrowed time. The air around the device grew heavier as we moved closer, and my mind began to fracture under the weight of it. It was like walking through water. Every movement felt sluggish, delayed, as though we were in a place not entirely bound by the laws of physics. The device pulsed with a low hum, and as I reached out to touch it, the temperature dropped to freezing in an instant. My fingers brushed against its surface, and for a moment, everything went still. The hum, the flickering lights, the shadowed shapes, everything stopped. And then, the darkness that had been pressing against the walls surged forward, its tendrils stretching out toward us. "Do not touch it," Miriam screamed, but it was too late. The moment I made contact, the world seemed to shatter. A blinding flash of light exploded from the device, filling the chamber. My vision blurred, and the ground seemed to buckle beneath me. The pulse of energy surged through my body, twisting and warping my senses. Time itself felt like it had stopped, like we were trapped in some frozen moment of existence. The shadows around us writhed, distorting into grotesque shapes, forms that should not have been able to exist. Pale humanoids, their features twisted into inhuman mockeries of life, appeared before us. Their eyes were hollow, empty, and they moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the floor as though they were weightless. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat slow and painful. My breath came in ragged gasps as I staggered back, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Get away from it!" I shouted to the team, my voice hoarse, but it barely reached their ears. The room was filled with a low, guttural sound, a distant chanting that seemed to come from all directions. It was not a human language. It felt ancient, alien, something beyond time. My head throbbed as the sound resonated deep within me, each pulse of the energy from the device sending a wave of nausea through my body. I could feel my grip on reality slipping. The air tasted like metal, sharp and bitter, and my chest tightened with a pressure I had never known. I could hear the whispers now, faint, indistinct, but they were there, coming from the shadows, calling my name. "No!" I gasped, my hands reaching out in panic, but there was nothing to grasp. The walls themselves seemed to shimmer, bending at impossible angles. My mind reeled. The symbols on the device began to glow brighter, their light more intense, and I could feel something ancient, something cosmic, stirring within the depths of the chamber. It was watching us. It had always been watching. "Yossi!" I yelled, but there was no response. He was frozen in place, staring at the shadows that now danced across the walls. Miriam was beside him, clutching her medical kit, but she too had fallen silent, her eyes wide with terror. Amir stood by the radio equipment, his face a mask of confusion and fear. The room felt suffocating. The pulse of energy grew louder, vibrating through my chest, making it hard to breathe. We had made a grave mistake. The shadows began to stretch and warp in impossible ways, twisting into forms that made no sense. One of them, larger than the others, stepped forward from the darkness. Its shape was shifting, its outline never fully defined, but there was something undeniably malevolent about it. It was not human, it was not of this world, and it was coming for us. The room was suffocating, the air thick with a pressure that made it difficult to think. Time itself seemed to stretch, growing sluggish and warped. The shadows, no, they were not mere shadows anymore, had taken on a life of their own, moving independently, crawling along the walls, twisting and contorting into unnatural shapes. I could feel something in the very fabric of reality breaking down, and for a brief moment, I wondered if the rules of time and space still applied. The world was warping before us, and I could do nothing but watch. Yossi was the first to snap out of the trance, his hand reaching for his weapon, but it seemed slow, sluggish. He looked around, confused, disoriented. The room was wrong. Everything was wrong. The energy from the device still pulsed in the air, heavy and thick. It hummed in my bones, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet, and I could feel my mind starting to unravel under its influence. I glanced at the others. Miriam was still frozen, her eyes wide and staring into the swirling shadows, and Amir's hands were trembling as he desperately tried to adjust his radio. "This is not right," Yossi muttered under his breath, his voice shaking as he lifted his weapon. "We need to get out of here, now." I wanted to agree, but something held me in place. The device, its energy was like a magnet, pulling me, calling me. I could feel it, an undeniable force tugging at the very core of my being. I fought against the compulsion to move closer, to reach out once more, but I could hear the whispers in the shadows, faint but growing louder. The voices were becoming more distinct, no longer just whispers. They were words, alien and incomprehensible, calling us by name, calling me. "Are you hearing that?" Miriam finally whispered, her voice trembling. I turned to her, and in her eyes I saw the same terror I felt within myself. She wasn't just hearing the whispers, she was feeling them too. The walls were alive, and something ancient was crawling through the cracks, seeping through the very fabric of reality. "Stay focused," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "We need to move now. Yossi, check the perimeter. Amir, get the signal back up. Miriam, stay close." But as I turned to give orders, the ground beneath us shifted, as though the very foundation of the facility was shifting, like the building itself was breathing. The walls groaned, low and deep, like some massive slumbering beast stretching after a long, restless sleep. There was a sudden, violent shaking just for a split second, but it felt like the entire facility was on the verge of collapse. The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch and contort into impossible shapes, shapes that should not have existed in the real world. "What was that?" Amir said, his voice breaking, his radio now useless static. His eyes were wide with panic. "Something is coming." Before I could respond, there was a sharp, echoing crack, like the sound of bones breaking, and then the air pressure seemed to drop further. I could feel it in my chest, a sudden crushing force that made it harder to breathe. It was as if the very atmosphere had become a vice, tightening around us. The device, glowing brighter now, hummed louder, its frequency vibrating through the air in a way that I could feel deep inside my skull. I felt nauseous, disoriented, and it was as though I was losing my grip on reality. I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind us. My head snapped toward the noise, but there was nothing there. Just shadows, flickering and twisting, as though they were alive, moving, crawling toward us. "Look out!" Yossi yelled, suddenly raising his weapon, but he was too slow. Before anyone could react, the air shimmered and the shadows lunged forward, writhing, reaching for him. I heard him scream, the sound distorted, as if it were being torn apart by the very air around him. The shadows twisted into something that was no longer a shape, but a monstrous, shifting form, its edges frayed and melting into the walls of the facility. Yossi struggled, but the shadowy tendrils wrapped around him, pulling him toward the darkened corner of the room. It was as if the facility itself was alive, and it was feeding on him, dragging him into some otherworldly abyss. His screams were cut short as he vanished into the dark. "No!" I shouted, rushing forward, but the air was thick with something that made it hard to move. It was like swimming through molasses, slow, impossible. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the closer I got to where Yossi had been, the more the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe around me. Miriam screamed, backing away into the corner of the room, her face a mask of horror. Amir was frozen, his eyes wide in disbelief as the shadows pulled him too, inch by inch, toward the same fate. "Get away from the walls!" I shouted, but my voice sounded distant, drowned by the noise of the strange, resonating hum filling the chamber. The walls creaked, groaned, and then there was a terrible crack, louder than before. The very structure of the building seemed to be coming apart. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the shadows receded, and the room fell into an eerie silence. The echoes of Yossi's scream still hung in the air, lingering like a fading memory. The device, still glowing, still humming, was the only thing left untouched. For a moment it seemed as though the very essence of the facility had collapsed, and we were left standing in the wreckage. I looked at Miriam and Amir. Both were pale, shaken, and still staring at the spot where Yossi had been dragged into the darkness. Neither of them spoke. They could not. I could hear the faint whispers again, louder this time. The walls were calling us, beckoning us into the depths. But I knew one thing for sure. We were not alone. The room was still, too still. The eerie silence settled in, thick and suffocating, leaving a metallic taste in my mouth. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as I looked at the spot where Yossi had disappeared. The shadows had receded for the moment, but their presence lingered in the air, like the residue of something unnatural. A constant, nagging hum pulsed through the walls, reverberating through my bones. The walls themselves seemed to shift slightly, as if they were breathing. Slow, labored, each breath growing heavier and more deliberate. The only sound was the soft shuffle of our boots against the cold, cracked stone floor. Miriam and Amir were still motionless, frozen in a state of shock, eyes wide, faces drained of color. The shadows had taken Yossi. We were alone now. Or were we? "Do you see that?" Miriam whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum. Her gaze was fixed on the far end of the room, where the light seemed to flicker, casting long, grotesque shadows along the walls. At first, I thought it was just the unstable lighting, but the longer I looked, the more I realized something was moving. Something was shifting in the darkness. The light seemed to be bending unnaturally, warping around the corners of the room. I motioned for Amir to check the perimeter, but he was too lost in his own thoughts, his fingers twitching over his radio equipment in futile attempts to regain control of the signal. There was no signal. There had never been any signal here. It was all part of the trap. Then, I saw it. Footprints, faint but unmistakable, appearing in the dust at the edge of the room. They were not our own. The prints were wrong, distorted, elongated and jagged, as if they did not belong to any creature we knew. They stretched across the floor and into the shadows, leading toward the dark corner of the room, where the strange flickering light danced. The temperature dropped even further, and the air became thick with an unseen presence, like something was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Footprints," I muttered under my breath, my voice barely rising above the hum. "They're not ours." I stepped cautiously forward, my eyes fixed on the marks in the dust. The prints, if that is what they were, appeared to shift as I moved closer. Each step I took seemed to twist the space around me, like the room itself was warping to accommodate whatever had left them behind. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to stop, to leave this place before we became part of it, but the compulsion to move forward was irresistible. The same pull that had drawn me to the device earlier was now tugging at me, dragging me into the darkness, into the unknown. "Stay close," I ordered, turning back to Miriam and Amir. They were still rooted to the spot, their eyes wide, faces frozen in a silent plea for explanation. But there was no explanation. There was only the thing that moved in the dark, the entity that had been waiting for us. The temperature continued to plummet as I followed the footprints, each one growing more distorted, more alien with each step. The shadows stretched farther now, impossibly long, and I could feel them moving behind me, reaching out as though they had minds of their own. A flicker of movement caught my eye, just beyond the corner of the room. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Just more shadows, more flickers, more uncertainty. The room seemed to grow tighter, the walls closing in. The shadows pressed against us, their forms twisting, stretching, becoming more tangible, more defined. I could feel them curling around me, pulling at my thoughts, clawing at my mind. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled there. Amir broke the silence. "There's something in the walls," he said, his voice shaky. "It's moving, something's inside. I'm picking up." He stopped suddenly, eyes widening as he looked at the space where the shadows seemed to converge. I turned toward him. "What do you mean, something's inside?" He didn't answer. Instead, his hand reached out, as if to touch the wall, but before his fingers could make contact, a violent tremor rippled through the ground. The floor beneath us groaned, as though something vast and heavy was shifting below. I grabbed Amir's arm, pulling him away from the wall just as cracks began to form, spiderwebbing out from the point where he had been about to touch. The wall, once solid, began to ripple, like a sheet of water disturbed by an unseen force. "Move!" I barked, my voice tight with panic. I turned to Miriam. "Miriam, move!" But it was too late. The wall trembled once more, and then with a sickening lurch, the surface seemed to tear open. A dark, gaping maw appeared, blacker than the deepest void, and from it emerged something too twisted to comprehend. It was a shifting, undulating form, part humanoid, part something else entirely, its limbs stretching and contorting in unnatural angles, as though reality itself was bending around it. It opened its mouth, or perhaps its maw, wide, and from it came a sound, low, guttural, a grinding noise that rattled through our teeth. The very air seemed to vibrate with the force of its presence. The thing moved toward us, its grotesque shape expanding as it advanced, reaching toward Amir first, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around his legs. He screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the entity. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around him like chains. Miriam and I stood frozen, our weapons raised. But they were useless. There was nothing we could do. The entity did not care about our presence, about our weapons. It was ancient, far beyond anything we had ever faced. As Amir's screams faded, swallowed by the creature's presence, the room seemed to close in around us. We were trapped, completely and utterly trapped in a reality that was no longer our own. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the thing stopped. The room fell silent once again, the air heavy with the smell of decay. Amir was gone. The only sign that he had ever been there was the faint imprint of his body in the dust, now slowly being erased by the ever-moving shadows. I turned to Miriam, but she was already backing away, her eyes wide in disbelief. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice thin and strained. "We can't stay here." But even as the words left her mouth, I knew the truth. We were never meant to leave. Whatever this place was, whatever the entity was, it had already claimed us. The air hung heavy around us, thick with a static charge, as the darkness in the room deepened. The entity, whatever it was, had made its presence known with unimaginable ferocity. Amir was gone, swallowed whole by the shifting void that had torn through the walls. His screams still echoed in my mind, distorted and fading like a distant memory. But even as his cries vanished, something worse was beginning to take form. The entity had not simply come for us, it had waited for us. It had been watching, learning, anticipating our every move. And now, it was ready to reveal itself. Miriam stumbled back, her breath shallow and quick, eyes darting in every direction as though looking for an escape that no longer existed. What is that thing?" she gasped, her voice a mere whisper. I couldn't answer her. What could I say? I had no words for this. I had no understanding of what we were facing. This thing, this entity, was not from our world, not from any world we knew. It was a being that existed outside of time, a presence that seemed to shift between dimensions, its form never fully stable, never fully real. The darkness in the room seemed to pulse around us, alive, as though it had a will of its own. The walls continued to twist and contort, the space around us stretching and collapsing in ways that defied all reason. The very foundation of the facility felt like it was disintegrating, and with it, our grip on reality. Every flicker of light that came from our headlamps cast grotesque shadows that twisted into horrifying shapes. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw the full extent of the creature's form. It was huge, its mass sprawling and shifting, but it was not solid. Its edges seemed to bleed into the space around it, its limbs long and spindly, ending in sharp, elongated fingers that seemed to stretch out of the dark like tendrils of smoke. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a nightmare. No features, no eyes, only a vast expanse of shifting darkness that moved and changed with every second. There was no mouth, no nose, only a formless shape that felt like it was peering into my very soul. I could feel it, this oppressive presence, pressing into me, like a weight upon my chest, suffocating me. The very air around it seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy, vibrating at a frequency that hurt to perceive. I could hear it in my head, faint whispers at first, like distant murmurs just beyond hearing. But then they grew louder, clearer. They were words, ancient words, not meant for human ears. I couldn't understand them, but the tone was unmistakable. It was speaking directly to us, or perhaps to me. It felt like it was inside my skull, inside my very being, rooting around in my thoughts, pulling at my deepest fears, my darkest memories. Miriam let out a choked sob, her hand trembling as she raised her weapon toward the entity. But she lowered it just as quickly, her face pale with terror. I could see it in her eyes. She had seen it too. This thing was beyond any force we had ever faced, beyond any technology, beyond even our understanding of the world. I tried to speak, to give some kind of order, but my voice caught in my throat. There was nothing to say. The walls around us groaned again, low and menacing, as though the entire facility were reacting to the presence of the entity. The floor beneath us shuddered, and I felt the oppressive weight of the darkness bearing down on me, pressing in, crushing me. I dared to take a step forward, and as I did, the entity shifted. Its tendrils seemed to stretch toward me, curling and twisting through the air, their movement fluid, almost liquid in their grace. One of them brushed against my arm, and a shock ran through me. A cold, paralyzing sensation that spread through my body, freezing me in place. I tried to move, but the sensation was like ice in my veins, locking me into place. And then, the creature, if it could be called a creature, spoke. The words were not words at all, but a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the very air, through the walls, through my bones. I felt the vibrations in my chest, a resonance that seemed to tear through the fabric of reality itself. I tried to make sense of the sounds, but they were beyond comprehension, beyond anything I had ever heard. Miriam screamed, but the sound was warped, distorted by the force of the entity's presence. The creature reached out again, this time closer, its form flickering and distorting as though it was not bound by any laws of nature. The light in the room warped, bending around the shifting darkness. Time, too, seemed to warp. Each second stretched impossibly long, and then, in the blink of an eye, it felt like hours had passed. The air around us grew heavier still, the weight of it pressing down until it was almost unbearable. It moved closer, its tendrils wrapping around the space between us, pulling the shadows tighter, suffocating the light. I heard the sound of something breaking. The walls, the very air itself seemed to be splitting apart. And then, Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity paused. I felt its attention shift, like a cold hand brushing over the back of my neck. The creature was aware of us, of our fear, of our confusion. It was toying with us, letting us feel the crushing weight of its power, testing our resolve. I could feel it in my bones. This entity was ancient, older than anything we could comprehend, and it was in no hurry. It didn't need to destroy us. No, it was patient. It could wait for us to destroy ourselves. And in that moment, I knew the truth. We were not here to contain this entity, to fight it, to escape it. We were here to serve as fuel for something much older, much more terrifying than we could understand. We were nothing but a brief interruption in its eternal existence, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. The entity, ever patient, had ceased its immediate assault, but its presence lingered, like a shadow stretched too thin, looming over us, its tendrils curling through the very air we breathed. The room felt like a different place now, its dimensions uncertain, its purpose unclear. The walls continued to breathe, moving slightly, pulsing in time with our rapid heartbeats, as though the very structure of the facility was resonating with the entity's unnatural energy. It was as if the space itself had become part of the creature, like we were walking through the remnants of its dream. I could feel my mind unspooling, my thoughts tangling in ways they should not. The air was thick with a stifling pressure, pressing down on me, on all of us. Miriam's face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief, but it was more than just fear. She looked as though she were being slowly, inexorably pulled away from her own self, her very essence slipping into the shifting darkness that coiled around the edges of her vision. She was losing grip on reality, and I knew that we all were. "You need to stay focused," I said, though I was no longer sure if I was speaking to Miriam or to myself. My voice sounded far too distant, too hollow. Even as I spoke, my own hands trembled, and I could feel the creeping sensation of something gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Miriam nodded, but it was a gesture without conviction. Her eyes fluttered as though she were struggling to hold on to some semblance of normalcy. Her hand went instinctively to her medical kit, but her fingers trembled so violently that she couldn't hold it steady. She looked at me, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, as if she had momentarily returned to herself. But then it happened. The shadows, the ones that had once merely twisted at the edges of the room, began to coalesce. They grew thicker, darker, and then, alive. The darkness itself seemed to breathe in time with Miriam's every movement. Her reflection in the flickering light warped and distorted. Her once bright, clear eyes turned glassy, their pupils expanding until they were pure black, no light at all. Her mouth opened, but the words that came out were not her own. They were slow, guttural, like an ancient language I had never heard. "This place," Miriam's voice echoed in a strange, haunting cadence, "has waited for eons. You are not the first. You will not be the last." I reached for her, desperate to pull her back, but the shadows seemed to crawl up her arms, twisting into her very skin, as though they were merging with her. Her body jerked as if under a violent, unseen force, and she collapsed to the ground. For a moment, I thought she was gone, consumed by the darkness. But then she stirred. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. "Miriam!" I shouted, but she didn't respond. Her head snapped up too quickly, and her eyes, once filled with concern, now held only an empty blackness. Her form twisted in on itself, her limbs elongating and distorting as she struggled to stand. Behind me, I heard Amir's voice, soft and distant, as though he were speaking from a far-off place. I turned to look at him, but what I saw was not the Amir I had known. His body had shifted, altered in a way that defied understanding. His skin was translucent, a pale blue-gray that seemed to shimmer with an eerie, unnatural light. His eyes were wide and unblinking, but they were not human anymore. They glowed, like twin pools of black ink that reflected the distorted world around him. He reached for his radio, but it was as though his hand was moving against its own will, each gesture deliberate, as if the air itself was pushing against him. "This is "This is wrong," Amir whispered, his voice barely audible. His mouth moved too slowly, as though the muscles were no longer responding in the way they should. The words he spoke weren't his. They were fragments of something ancient, something beyond our understanding. And then came the most terrifying thing of all, his reflection in the flickering light. It was no longer his reflection. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. The flickering light cast his shadow, but the shadow did not move as he did. It stretched unnaturally, twisting with a life of its own, like it was trying to escape from his body. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, trying to process the scene unfolding before me. But it was all happening too fast, too wrong. The room seemed to bend and contort with every passing moment, as if reality itself was warping under the pressure of the entity's presence. The walls, the shadows, the very air around us, all seemed to press inward, collapsing together, warping our perception of time and space. I grabbed Miriam's arm, my hand slipping on her skin as the shadows continued to climb over her, pulling her into them like a drowning man pulled under the waves. Her form had become thin and stretched, as if she were being twisted out of existence. Her voice came again, but it was not her own. It was an echo of something far older, something from beyond. "You cannot escape," she intoned, her voice distorted and alien. "It is too late." "Get a grip, Miriam," I shouted, but the words felt useless. There was no reality to hold on to anymore. The room was collapsing around us. The floor beneath my feet cracked open, and I felt the ground giving way beneath me. It was like we were falling into some abyss, some void that swallowed us whole, but the fall never seemed to end. Time lost all meaning here, and with it, our chances of survival. The shadows, now living things, slithered toward us, stretching, growing, pulling at our very souls. The entity, in all its monstrous, unrecognizable form, was not in a hurry. It did not need to destroy us immediately. It could wait. It could always wait. But even as we stood on the brink of the impossible, something within me refused to accept defeat. I still clung to that final shred of hope, the belief that we might find a way to escape, even as the darkness pressed in around us, even as our very minds began to unravel. The entity had broken us, and yet somehow we were still here, trapped in this collapsing world, fighting for something we could no longer name. The walls of the facility groaned again, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The air trembled, vibrating with an intensity that felt like it would tear us apart. The shadows stretched out farther now, twisting toward us with insidious intent. The floor beneath our feet buckled and cracked, as if the very foundations of reality were being upended. I could hear the others, their breathing ragged, their voices hollow as they tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the pressure of the atmosphere. We were trapped in a collapsing world, held in place by the suffocating weight of something ancient, something cosmic, that had no care for our suffering. Miriam's body, once human, was now a twisted reflection of something else. Her skin stretched tight, translucent, pulsing with an eerie glow. The shadows had taken hold of her, burrowing deep beneath her skin. She no longer resembled the woman who had been with us at the start of the mission. Her face was blank, her eyes black voids, but there was a flicker of recognition in them. Just a brief, fleeting moment before it disappeared entirely, consumed by the darkness. Her limbs had elongated unnaturally, her fingers twisting like serpents, and the shadows that clung to her now seemed to move with a life of their own. "Miriam?" I whispered, my voice barely rising above the ambient hum. The words hung in the air, disjointed and useless. She didn't respond. Her mouth opened, but the words that came out were not hers. They were ancient, guttural sounds, like a language that had not been spoken by human mouths in eons. "This is what you sought," Miriam's voice echoed in the room, now distorted, altered, unrecognizable. "The door is open. You are already part of it." I couldn't tear my eyes away from her, even as I felt the suffocating grip of the entity tightening around us. The walls around us twisted, the shadows flickering and changing in impossible patterns. The device, the key, was still at the far end of the room, glowing with an unearthly light. It pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat, distant and alien. There was something about it that called to me, something that wanted me to touch it, to give myself over to whatever power it held. Behind me, I heard Amir, or what was left of him. His body was no longer human. It was a hollow shell, a grotesque distortion of flesh and light. His face was an amalgamation of shapes that flickered and shifted like a broken mirror, and his limbs moved with an unnatural fluidity, too fast, too inhuman. He was no longer speaking, no longer the man who had been our communications expert, but something else, something far older. The shadowy tendrils that had once claimed his body had now consumed him entirely. He moved toward me, or toward the device. I could not tell, his form slipping in and out of existence, his voice distorted by the hum of the entity. "Do not fight it." Amir's voice came, but it was not his voice. It was something alien, something from beyond the stars. "You cannot escape what has always been here. It has always been here." I felt the pull. It was subtle at first, but it grew stronger with each passing second. It was as though the very air was pulling me, the force of it too powerful to ignore. I resisted, but it felt futile. The shadows had infiltrated my thoughts, and I could feel them curling around my mind, twisting my perception of reality. The ground shifted beneath my feet, the walls expanding and contracting as if breathing in time with the entity's pulse. There was no escape. The doors we had entered through were gone. Nothing remained of the outside world. The facility, the jungle, the desert. They were all just fading memories now, replaced by this place. This void. The walls stretched endlessly, as if we were now part of some cosmic prison, a place outside of time, outside of everything we had known. I could feel the walls pressing in, folding, becoming tighter and tighter, but it was the shadows that truly held us. They were pulling us deeper, pulling us toward the center of the room, toward the device, toward the heart of whatever this place had become. I reached out, my hand trembling, and for a moment I thought I might actually touch it, might succumb to the entity's call. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something else, a flicker of movement. Miriam, or what had once been Miriam, was closer now, her eyes glowing with a sickly light as she reached for me. I knew it wasn't her. It couldn't be. Whatever she had become, whatever we had become, was no longer human. Then, the entity itself made its presence known. The walls split open with a deafening sound, the force of it shaking the very bones of the facility. The shadows rippled outward, pulling everything into them. The ground beneath me cracked open, and before I could even react, I was falling into the darkness, deeper into the black void that had consumed everything. I heard Miriam's voice one last time, echoing from all around me, from everywhere and nowhere at once. "It will wait." And then I fell. The world dissolved. Time shattered. There was nothing but darkness. I awoke in darkness. The sudden absence of sound was the first thing I noticed. The hum, the pulse of energy that had filled the room, was gone. The oppressive weight that had pressed in on me, suffocating every breath, had lifted, but in its place there was an eerie stillness, a silence so profound it felt unnatural. It was as though the world had come to a halt, frozen in time. The air was cold, impossibly cold, and I could taste the metallic tang of it in my mouth, sharp and bitter. I shivered, my body trembling as I slowly pulled myself up, my limbs weak, as though I had been lying in this abyss for an eternity. I reached out, my hand brushing against the cold, hard floor. The surface beneath me was unfamiliar, stone, rough and jagged. I pushed myself to my feet, my head spinning with disorientation. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as though it was shifting beneath my weight. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind, but the world around me remained blurry, indistinct. There were no walls here, no ceiling, just an expanse of endless shadow, stretching out in all directions. It took me a moment to realize I was alone. I scanned the void around me, my breath shallow and quick, but there was no sign of Miriam, no sign of Amir. I called their names, my voice echoing strangely in the empty space, but it felt distant, as though I were speaking into a vacuum. The silence swallowed my words, and the weight of isolation pressed against me with an intensity that left me breathless. My heart raced, panic rising in my chest, as I realized that I had no idea where I was, how I had gotten here, or how I could possibly escape. The feeling of dislocation was overwhelming. The ground, the air, the very fabric of reality itself felt unstable, as though it were coming apart at the seams. I staggered forward, stumbling through the darkness, but there was nothing to guide me, no point of reference. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly as if the very concept of space had been warped beyond recognition. Then, the first disturbance came. A flicker in the distance, just a brief flickering light. It was pale, almost ethereal, and it seemed to beckon me, drawing me forward like a distant memory I could not fully recall. I took a step toward it, then another, my movements slow, deliberate, as if the air itself was pressing back against me. The sensation was disorienting. The more I walked, the further the light seemed to stretch away, until it felt like I was chasing something that would forever remain just out of reach. Suddenly the ground beneath me trembled, a low rumble that sent a shockwave through the air. The light flickered again, brighter this time, and I felt an unnatural pull, like gravity had shifted, dragging me toward it. I took another step, and then the air snapped, sharp, sudden, as though a thin veil had been torn apart. The world lurched, the floor beneath me cracked open, and I fell. I hit the ground hard, my body slamming into the cold stone with a force that left me gasping for breath. My head spun, and I struggled to push myself up. But the sensation of falling, the sensation of being pulled towards something, was overwhelming. It was as if the ground had opened up beneath me, swallowing me whole, and now I was suspended in some liminal space, caught between reality and something far darker, far older. I forced myself to stand, my hands shaking as I looked around. The light was gone, swallowed up by the endless shadows. But the sensation remained. The pull, the force that dragged at me, urging me forward. I didn't know where I was going, but the urge to move was inescapable, as if some primal instinct within me knew that the only way out was through whatever this place had become. And then, just as I took another step, the world shifted again. A ripple passed through the air, a distortion that made my skin crawl. The shadows around me twisted, folding in on themselves, and I felt the presence of something moving, something watching. The air grew colder once more, and the metallic taste in my mouth intensified, as though I were breathing in pure, unfiltered decay. The ground beneath my feet cracked, the rift widening as the fabric of this place tore even further. There was no more certainty, no more stability, only a relentless, unyielding descent into something that had no name, something beyond human comprehension. I knew then that I wasn't alone in this space. Whatever force had been guiding me, whatever ancient presence had been pulling at me, was not finished with me. It wasn't letting go. You cannot leave. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed through my mind, filling the empty space with its alien cadence, its cold, mocking tone. I turned, panic rising in my chest. But there was nothing, no visible form, no shape, just the oppressive darkness. Yet I felt its presence, its awareness pressing down on me, suffocating me. You will remain here. The voice was closer now, as though it were speaking directly into my ear, and I felt the air grow heavy with its words, each syllable a weight, a force pressing against me from all sides. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the cracked stone floor. But no matter how hard I tried to move, to escape, the shadows continued to stretch toward me, wrapping around me like a vice. My chest tightened with the growing pressure, and I felt my breath quicken as the darkness closed in. I had been pulled into this place, into this rift between worlds, and now there was no escaping it. The entity had claimed me. The walls, the shadows, the very ground beneath me, they were all part of it, and it would not let me go. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The air was thick, suffocating, and the world around me twisted further, distorting into shapes that were impossible to understand. Time was collapsing, and the sensation of falling, of being lost, grew more intense with every passing moment. And then, I realized the truth. There was no escape. The walls had closed around us, and we had become part of its world. The entity, whatever it was, had already claimed us. We were its prisoners, bound to this place for eternity, lost in a nightmare that had no end. There was no way out. Time was an illusion now. When I finally awoke, if you could call it waking, I was no longer the same person. My body ached, as though it had been twisted and reshaped in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. The air around me was cold, but it wasn't just the temperature. It felt like the very essence of the space was leaching warmth from my skin, from my soul. The darkness that surrounded me was thick, viscous, as if it had substance, something tangible, and it clung to my senses like a weight that wouldn't lift. My limbs moved sluggishly, my thoughts fragmented, as if they too had been torn apart and reassembled by an alien force. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, uncoordinated. I looked around and saw shadows. Always the shadows, creeping along the edges of my vision, stretching, contorting, reaching for me. I couldn't even be sure if they were real, or if they were just the product of the madness that had begun to take root in my mind. The room, or whatever this place was, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its shape ever-changing, its boundaries forever in flux. The air tasted metallic, and each breath I took felt wrong, as though I were inhaling something other than oxygen, something that wasn't meant to sustain life. I reached for my sidearm, but the familiar weight of it was gone. I couldn't even feel the cold steel, only the emptiness of its absence. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, a recognition that I was no longer human, or at least, not the person I had been before. The change had already begun. I could feel it in my very bones. "Miriam?" I whispered, my voice hollow, distant. I didn't know what I was expecting, but the silence that followed was all-consuming. There was nothing left of her, not in the way I remembered. The person who had once been part of our team was gone, consumed by the very shadows that had twisted this place into a nightmarish version of reality. The darkness had taken her, had pulled her into itself, and now there was only the void, the oppressive weight of the unknown. I stumbled forward, my feet dragging as I moved through the shifting, endless expanse. It was impossible to tell if I was walking in circles or if the room itself was changing with every step. I couldn't focus on anything for too long. Each thought fractured, disintegrating before I could fully grasp it. But the feeling, the presence, was always there. Close, just beyond the edges of my perception, watching, waiting. Then a soft sound broke through the silence. It was faint at first, just a whisper on the wind. If it was even the wind, I couldn't tell. But then it grew louder, more distinct. A voice. Not Miriam's, not Amir's. This one was alien, otherworldly, its tone jagged and dissonant. It seemed to echo from all around me, from the walls, from the very fabric of the space itself. The voice was familiar but distorted, like a memory I couldn't quite place. "It is not finished," the voice said, its words sinking deep into my mind. I felt a jolt in my chest, a painful tightening, as if the words were lodged there, refusing to leave. It was a presence, a force that had never left us. It had just been waiting, waiting for the right moment to take. The walls around me shifted, their shape altering at an impossible angle. A door, or what looked like a door, appeared in the wall ahead of me, its edges fraying, dissolving into the surrounding shadows. Without thinking, my body moved toward it. There was no logic in it, just an instinctual drive to escape, to find something familiar, something real. But the door was not real. It was only a promise of escape, one that the entity would allow, but not without its cost. As I reached for the door, the room around me began to warp again. The shadows, which had been curling at the edges of my vision, began to move. No, they shifted. They no longer clung to the corners of the room. They filled the space, surrounding me, pressing in on me like a physical presence, suffocating. The door faded in and out of existence, its edges blurring with the shifting shadows. In the distance, a figure appeared. At first, I thought it was Miriam. It had to be. But as the figure drew closer, I saw the truth. It was not her. It was Amir, or at least it looked like Amir. His body, his face, it was distorted, unrecognizable, as though the entity had taken what was left of him and twisted it into something else entirely. His skin was pale, translucent, and I could see the light beneath it. No longer human, no longer alive in any sense that I understood. "Amir?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't respond. He couldn't respond. His eyes, once sharp and analytical, were now empty voids, black, featureless, and endless. His mouth moved, but the words that came out were not human. The language was guttural, unearthly, and it rattled through the air like the sound of something ancient, something that shouldn't have been uttered by a living being. "You are the last." The voice that spoke wasn't Amir's. It was the entity speaking through him. "You are the last of your kind." I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, as if the very floor beneath me had become a part of the entity's web. The shadows seemed to close in tighter, coiling around me like chains. Amir's form shifted again, his limbs contorting at impossible angles, the edges of his body bending and snapping like brittle glass. He took a step toward me, and I could feel the air grow heavier, thicker, pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but my body refused to respond. The air tasted of decay, of something old, and I could feel the oppressive weight of it all pressing in from every direction. "You will remain, as we all have remained." Amir's form whispered, his voice now completely alien. "You are part of it now. There is no escape." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around me, consuming me, until I could see nothing but darkness. And in the distance I could hear the entity laughing, its voice echoing through my mind as it took what little was left of me. The extraction was too smooth. I should have known that something was wrong, but the urgency, the need to get out, to return to somewhere familiar, overwhelmed every instinct I had left. The ride back was a blur. The sensation of air rushing past, the hum of the chopper blades, the metallic scent of sweat and fear. Everything felt strangely distant, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Even the desert, sprawling beneath us as we ascended from that hellish place, seemed to fade into nothingness as though it never existed at all. By the time we touched down at the base, I had lost all sense of time. The mission was over, or at least it seemed over. The weight of what had happened, of what we had witnessed, was pushed to the back of my mind, suppressed. But the feeling never left. No matter how much I tried to push it away, there was always something gnawing at the edges of my consciousness, like a small piece of a puzzle that refused to fit. The shadows had followed us. I knew it. I could feel them in every dark corner, every flicker of light, but no one would speak of it. Not now, not ever. The debriefing room was cold, sterile, exactly what I needed to shake the haze from my mind. I sat in the chair, feeling the weight of the official process settling onto my shoulders. A large table stood in front of me, its polished surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. At the far end of the room, a pair of officers sat, their faces impassive, unreadable. They were the ones who would write this all down, who would sanitize what had happened, erasing the raw truth and replacing it with something more acceptable. I could feel their eyes on me, but they never asked the questions that mattered. They already knew. They already understood. They had their orders. They had their story. "Report, Agent," one of the officers said, his voice a hollow monotone. His gaze never left the paperwork in front of him, the tip of his pen hovering just above the page. I began to speak, but as the words left my mouth, I noticed something strange. The sentence didn't sound like mine. It was as if someone else had written it, as though my body had moved on its own, speaking from a place deeper than my control. I felt myself recounting the mission, the moments we had spent in that godforsaken facility, the shadows that had swallowed my team, the device, the presence we had found. But the words were clinical, detached. I wasn't telling the truth, and neither were they. The officer's pen scratched across the paper, writing the sanitized version of events. No mention of the supernatural, no mention of the entity, no mention of the twisted horrors we had witnessed. I could feel my own memories slipping away from me, as though they were being erased, rewritten into something far less dangerous, something easier to accept. "You will be reassigned," the second officer said without looking up. His voice was flat, but there was something there, something behind the eyes that gave away the illusion of indifference. They knew, but they couldn't talk about it. No one could. The rest of the debriefing passed in a haze, the words blurring together as I mechanically answered questions about the mission, about the logistics, about everything except what we had truly encountered. The officers never pushed. They never pressed. They didn't need to. They had all the answers already. They were erasing everything as quickly as I spoke, sealing it all away in a compartment labeled classified. After what seemed like hours, they dismissed me. There were no reassurances, no comforts. Just the cold, clinical formality of the military machine, sealing the truth away in whatever file would be buried next. The officer's final words echoed in my mind as I left the room. Mission complete. Disband the unit. Suppress. I walked out of the debriefing room, but it didn't feel like I was walking. It felt like I was being moved, like my legs were moving of their own accord. I was detached from my own body, floating in the haze of my memories. The hallways around me were empty, the sterile white walls reflecting my own confusion back at me. The sounds of footsteps, of voices, of the world moving around me. None of it felt real. The shadows had followed me back. I knew it. The team had been scattered, reassigned. As I moved toward the exit, I tried to reach out for something, anything, that could tether me to the world outside of this nightmare. But nothing came. No answers. No explanations. The doors of the base opened before me, and the bright sunlight flooded in. But it didn't feel like sunlight. It felt alien, like it was shining through the wrong lens. The world outside had changed. The shadows were still there, lurking just beneath the surface of everything I saw. In the corners of my vision, I could see them shifting, stretching, waiting for me to acknowledge them. The drive back to my apartment was surreal. The city was too quiet, too still, as though the world around me had been suspended in time, frozen in place. I passed familiar streets, familiar landmarks, but they all felt off. The air smelled wrong. The people seemed distant, their faces blurry as if I were looking through a fogged window. I could feel it. The presence. The thing that had been with us in that facility was still with me. The shadows had followed me. When I finally arrived at my apartment, I barely noticed the time. I walked in, closed the door behind me, and sank onto the couch. Everything seemed so normal. The same apartment I had always lived in, the same objects, but there was no comfort here. The shadows clung to the edges of the room, slipping across the walls in ways that were impossible to ignore. I sat in the silence, feeling it crush me. I tried to write, to make sense of it all, to put the pieces together, but the words wouldn't come. They twisted and contorted, slipping away from my grasp. I tried to recall the details of the mission, the others, the creature, the device. But every time I tried to speak, every time I tried to write, the words changed, turning into something else entirely. The truth was slipping through my fingers. And then, the lights began to flicker. I watched, transfixed, as they pulsed in time with the shadows, shifting in a way that was far too deliberate, far too intentional. I could hear the soft hum of the electricity, but it wasn't the usual hum. It was wrong. It was something more, something beyond the simple hum of power lines. The walls seemed to pulse along with it, the room breathing in sync with the vibrations, and then I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, too heavy for a human. I froze. I didn't move. The shadows stretched farther across the walls, their shapes warping in impossible ways. The door creaked. The footsteps drew closer. Too close. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. I looked down at my watch. The time was wrong. It was always wrong. And then, I heard it again. That voice. The one that had spoken to me through a mirror. It will wait. And this time, it was in the room with me. The room felt alive in ways I could never have imagined. I sat there, motionless, my eyes glued to the flickering lights overhead, each pulse of light casting long, malformed shadows across the walls. The walls were no longer just walls. They were breathing, undulating, alive. The air felt thick with something ancient, something that stretched back beyond the fabric of time itself. I could hear it now, the sound of something moving just out of sight. The footsteps that had been so heavy, so deliberate, were closer now. Too close. They were coming from the hallway, just outside my door, but they sounded wrong. They were not the footsteps of a person. They were something else, something that was waiting. I tried to stand, to move, but my body refused to obey. The air seemed to press in on me, the room constricting, growing smaller. The shadows stretched further, reaching across the floor, curling around the furniture, as if they were trying to engulf everything in sight. It felt as though I was being pulled into the very walls, into the heart of this place that had never truly let me go. My pulse quickened, my chest tight with the weight of what was happening. But still, I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I could hear them, feel them, vibrating through the walls. They weren't human. They couldn't be. There was no natural rhythm to them, no heartbeat beneath their cadence. It was something far older, far more primal, a presence that had been waiting for me, for us. And then the door creaked open. I didn't see anything at first, only a deep, suffocating blackness standing in the doorway. The shadows poured into the room, crawling along the floor, creeping up the walls, spreading like ink in water. It was in the shadows, the very air itself, that I felt it. The presence that had followed me, that had haunted me since we left that cursed place. The thing that had been with us, in the facility, in the jungle, in the very fabric of reality itself, was now here with me. Its presence consumed everything, filling the room, suffocating me with its weight. Then, I saw it. A shape, humanoid but not moving in the doorway. It was an impossibility. Its form flickered like a broken image on a screen, shifting between dimensions, its shape warping and stretching in ways that defied nature. It was a shadow, but not. It was a presence, but not one I could ever truly comprehend. The only thing that I knew for certain was that it was alive, and it was watching me, waiting for me. I couldn't look away. I was trapped in its gaze, in its infinite, patient eyes. And then, the whisper came. It was the same voice I had heard in the facility, the same voice that had spoken to us through the shadows, through a mirror. But this time, it was closer. It was here, in the room with me, in my very mind. It does not need to destroy you. It can wait for you to destroy yourself. The words echoed through me, vibrating in my bones, resonating deep within my soul. I felt them crawl into my mind, twisting my thoughts, unmaking everything I had ever known. The shadows moved faster now, their shapes flickering, shifting, stretching impossibly long, their forms changing, just as the entity had changed, just as we had changed. It was a force beyond comprehension, beyond anything I had ever known. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was as though I was suspended in time, trapped in the moment before the end, the moment when the walls of reality would finally collapse. The air grew heavier, and the walls seemed to press in closer, folding in on themselves, as if the very space I was in were crumbling under the weight of the entity's presence. The footsteps outside had stopped, but the door remained open, the shadows still pouring into the room, crawling along the walls, across the ceiling, all around me. I heard the soft sound of something breathing, something unnatural, something that should not have been able to breathe. The entity was here, with me, and it was waiting, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to understand what it was, what I had become. I could feel it now deep in my chest, in my very being. It was not an enemy, not a force that sought to destroy us. No, it was older than that. It was patient. It had no need to fight, to destroy. It didn't need to chase us. It simply needed to wait. We would do the rest. The entity knew that, in time, we would destroy ourselves, It didn't need to do anything. It just had to be there. The shadows were everywhere now, filling every corner of the room, stretching over every surface, filling the air with their presence. And I knew that it would never leave me. The entity was not just in this room, not just in the facility, not just in the shadows. It was in me. It had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to make itself known. As the darkness enveloped me completely, I heard the last whisper, the last echo of the entity's voice, as it resonated through the very core of my being. You are part of it now. And in that moment, I understood. I understood that the entity had never needed to destroy us. It never wanted to. It simply needed us to fall, to unravel, to destroy ourselves in our futile struggle to escape it. We were never meant to win. We were never meant to survive. It could wait. It always had. And now, it was waiting for the rest of us to finish what we had started.